Okay, hello Mashiad. Hello Georgie. We're just getting started
Hello,
here. Hello.
hello.
Good to see you. Um, all right, so today is when we are focusing on the narrative text analysis and talking through a bit qualitative research methods and specifically on doing coding and qualitative analysis. And I think I asked last class, but if maybe raise your hand if you've done kind of qualitative coding and qualitative analysis before. Good, John. Okay, so some folks have. So for some, it'll be maybe a little repeat and new for some others. It's always good to, walk through it again. And so as a reminder, I'd asked you today to bring, a short segment from your interview. And also a reminder that, with your interview, you were to be doing the informed consent form. And so I'd seen some of those. And so just making sure that we always take care of that and any that's those also are held onto as well, as long as the research or beyond. And typically, you'd also, if possible, get a copy to those who are signing it, or if it's done orally, being able to provide them either a recording of that, or just so if that folks they can have it as well. I know it's not always possible, but just as kind of a good practice when it is possible to do that. And so just a reminder, making sure that folks have been doing that informed consent. And then today, in talking about coding, when we say coding for qualitative data, it's a way of sorting your data to analyze it. It's not the analysis itself. It's a way of organizing the data collected, because it can be, having one interview is one thing, but if you have, say, 50 interviews and you have 200 pages of field notes and transcripts from focus groups and other activities, that can feel very overwhelming where to start. And so coding is a way to really organize the data to be able to then analyze it. So I just want to make that clear, that it's not the analysis itself. It's a way to organize all of that qualitative information, all of the narrative text that will then set you up quite well to be able to analyze it in a much more kind of rigorous and robust manner. And so what I'd like to do, we're going to go into breakouts in just a few minutes here, but I wanted to share with you, let me pull this up and share my screen. Oops, would help if I hit share screen. All right. A little better. Can y'all see the, whoops. Can y'all see the document okay? Okay, so this was the reading that I had you do today from Paul Farmer. He's a medical anthropologist who had started years ago an organization, Partners in Health, in Haiti. And he lives mostly in Haiti, sometimes on the East Coast in the US. He goes between a bit. But this was a piece he put together and became quite well read globally in a lot of ways, of really this articulation around the issue of structural violence. And the way he talked about this kind of what sounds quite abstract and theoretical, the way he got at explaining ideas around this idea of structural violence was through the two stories he shares in this article about Asefi. And then later on, there's another story about a man named Chow. And so in this first section where he tells Asefi's story. And this is really a telling where Asefi had, later on, she passed on from AIDS. This was in, I believe, the early 1990s when these interviews were done. It might have been a little bit later. Actually, it's probably maybe late 90s, but it was some years ago now. And when he'd done these interviews and trying to really kind of dig into what happened, this was a real highlight that stood out as to understanding Asefi's story. And the quote that you read was, "What would you have me do? I could tell that the old people were uncomfortable, worried, but they didn't say no. They didn't tell me to stay away from him." And him is General Honorat, who was the older military gentleman who had passed on HIV to her. "They didn't tell me to stay away from him. I wish they had, but how could they have known? I knew it was a bad idea then, but I just didn't know why. I never dreamed he would give me a bad illness, never. I looked around and saw how poor we all were, how the old people were finished. What would you have me do? It was a way out. That's how I saw it." Now, in that short narrative text, are there any kind of key words or themes that stick out to you in that?
Yeah, uncertainty.
What's that, Robert?
I said uncertainty and fear of the unknown, and then looking back and trying to put it together. What happened to me?
Uncertainty, fear,
Reflection, I
unknown.
guess. Yeah.
What's that?
Reflection, I guess, is a better way to put it.
Reflection. She's speaking about economic status. She's speaking about health. She's speaking about, is there a way out? She's speaking about across generations, right? So we start to see all of these, the fear, the uncertainty, these are all themes we start to see emerge in this text. And so those would be codes. So a code you might have a code for poverty. You might have a code that is fear. You might have a code that's health. And within that, there might be sub themes as well. So she might talk about health here, and then in other narrations, there might be aspects within talking about health that might be important to note. And so, can you all see this okay? Where it says the qualitative research methods coding exercise. Okay, so this was also what I had put up for you to read for this week, and I'm going to scroll down here because the instructions are actually on the second page. It's a little awkward, but so when we're talking about doing coding, we're first talking about how do you develop your codes, and these are developed, like what we just said, into main categories and subcategories. So like you could say main themes and sub-themes, categories and subcategories. And so when we look at the example that I had posted, this was just a random interview grabbed, that as the interview, the transcription you're looking at, the question is, can you tell me how you became interested in sport? And now the interviewer starts coding in the red as to what the interviewee is talking about. So these are the themes being pulled out. There's many reasons they're interested because of parents, school, football. What sports do you take part in? They start talking about football again, jogging. They get into where I hurt my knees, so injuries, putting on weight gain, right? You start to see, just like what we did in Asefi's narrative, you start to see these themes emerge. Again, going back to jogging. And so the main themes or categories you're starting to see these codes emerging are for these types of sport, right? So types of sport is kind of the main category. And then within that was raised ideas around football, around jogging. These are your subcategories. And you continue to build on this. And so if you kept reading more interview transcripts about this question around sport, you might start to see, okay, we have this theme about the types of sport, you have this category, and then you start to get into these subcategories. We had football and jogging. Maybe in the next interview transcript, they talk about rugby. And the next one, someone else is talking about badminton and cricket. And the way that you kind of handle all this information, is up to you. Some people will keep, these words, these phrases, right? So anytime you see, you could put out type of sport, you could put football. However, as you go through, and depending, if you have a very large research study, you could literally have hundreds of categories and subcategories. And so one way to organize that is having a numbering scheme. So that way, when you're going through to what's called code an interview, instead of every time it says type, every time type of sport is raised, instead of writing that out, you might write an A for type of sport. And then instead of having to write football out each time, you might write A1, A2, A3, and so forth. And so that can be a good way to kind of do shorthand so that you have what those numbers map to in terms of your categories and subcategories. And so the overall point of this is there's no like hard and fast rule of this is exactly how you have to code. And this is exactly the kind of numbering scheme you have to use. The key is developing a system that works for you. And that as you're going through this, it's very much an iterative process, meaning that you're always going back. For example, if you have a bunch of interviews, you're always going back to interviews that you maybe coded first. You're going back to those as you're going through more interviews, because you'll have more categories and subcategories that emerge. And as you have more categories and subcategories emerge, you want to go back through the material that you already coded to then see, oh, okay, is this other theme I've now seen emerge? Is this other subcategory, is it coming up here as well? And so just because you say, if you have 10 interviews and you start with interview 1 and you code that, by the time you get to interview 10, you're going back to look through interview 1 again, because you'll now see, okay, here is all these other categories and subcategories that have emerged. And so it's not just going through each of these once, it's going to be multiple times as you start to see new ideas emerge. And again, just the reminder that after you go through this coding process is when you move from coding into analysis. And so the way to, use this, again, that coding is a tool to organize. And so what you can now do is you can take from, say you have 10 interviews, and this isn't just coming from interviews, it's coming from any qualitative data. So if it's field notes, if you've done participatory research activities, if it's taking notes, if you did a transect walk from participant observation, it's all of the qualitative information is being coded in this way. And then what you can do is, and you take, say if you're there is coding software you can use that comes with bells and whistles and costs a bazillion dollars. That if you happen to be, connected to a university, you can often access it that way, not always. But this is also something you don't have to use fancy software and the bazillion dollars that it costs. This is something that you can do either if you have documents, say on a computer, or if you have anything that's, hard copies in print, you can literally cut and paste things together. Or on a computer, you can highlight, okay, every time the category of football comes up, maybe instead of a number code, you give it a color and you highlight it and you make that text orange. And then when jogging comes up, you make that text green. And so again, coming up with what works for you. I personally like doing colors because that's how I can then go back through, very quickly see, okay, here's every time jogging comes up. These are all of my greens. And so I copy every time I see that green and I put it into another document. I make it clear where it's coming from, so in case I need to go back to it. But that way, from all these hundreds of pages maybe of material I now have one document that has all of my, everything that was talked about in terms of type of sport and everything that was talked about, say, regarding jogging altogether, regarding football altogether. If Dr. Farmer was going to do this with the study that we started with a Cepheus story, right? And he has many of these stories collected, that I would imagine there might be one document that's on health, right? And within that is going to say, okay, here's where everyone talked about ideas around health, right? And then maybe there's going to be subcategories of physical health, mental health, spiritual health. And there might even be subcategories within that. If you're talking about mental health, you can imagine that there's a number of kind of subcategories within that. And so getting down to whatever kind of granular level makes sense for you and your work. Again, this is, and that way, bringing all this information together now gives you a much easier ability to go in and analyze that information. So you can start to see, okay, within these themes, within this sub-theme, what's really going on here. You can start to see, you can cross code and see, okay, wow, every time that someone talks about health, they also talk about poverty. So you might have a sentence that has more than one code in it, right? Very often you'll have, say, a sentence with multiple of these codes in it. So you can start to see how these themes come together. And so, wow, every time they talk about fear, they're also talking about a figure of authority. What's going on there? Every time it talks about football, they're talking about injury. What's going on there? So that's where you really start to be able to see how these different themes might interact. And that is what can help kind of really guide that qualitative analysis, because I know that that can always be daunting. Often we turn more to surveys and quantitative analysis where things we can count, right? If you do a survey, you can count a lot of, but not always, because even with the survey, you might have open-ended questions, or you might have questions where people are writing something out, right? Or it's not going to be just A, B, C. And so that's a way to analyze that information, the qualitative part of, say, a questionnaire. Any questions or thoughts, or if anyone would like to kind of share from experiences you might have had in this to date?
Well, if I may, I well, I had to change. I had to change my original subject because there was some scheduling problems. Unfortunately, I found somebody that was a different kind of person raising livestock, not my target, but it was someone from the community that I got, and the interview surprised me because, well, it surprised me based on the notes that we're covering today and what I reviewed later. Because during the interview, I thought, well, I'm losing control of everything because even though I had prepared questions that led to other things, the recording is longer than I expected. I transcribed a portion of that and it almost seems disconnected, at least at that time. And I was a little bit just kind of nervous because it's like, well, what's the relevance of all of this? But I'm seeing now more relevance. I suppose it's just one person of, thousands of people, but I guess that part was difficult, and the coding does help to draw out those themes that I wasn't seeing when I was just right after. And I thought, how am I going to do an analysis? I don't even know. I know that this is there's some concern. There's already the person themselves when you're interacting with them, with this person. And that was, like I said, I had to improvise, and thankfully it came through. There's been a lot of bad weather here too, so people we even had to shelter in place. It was a lot of issues going on, all of which are environmental and relevant issues. So everybody was with a little bit of trepidation in the state of mind, and I was surprised to find now more themes that speak to that more subtly, I guess. And really, the hardest thing was to figure out, well, why do you even do this? Like, well, I just like it, to get to the point. So that was, I mean, these are the subject I got. The original one, I'm still going to be able to meet up with, but just have to change the schedule. But the one that the wonderful person that was, big enough is someone that has a plot of land down the road and always had some livestock. And I just introduced myself. I was like, I need to do this, and is there any way I can talk to you? And I've spoken with her before a little bit. Was perhaps not themselves hadn't reflected upon why they do it. It's just something I do that I like to do, and it was hard to figure out the wheels turning for them. What am I after? What's my agenda? Even though it was very friendly, I could still see, well, what is the right answer that I should give you? And that's where I feel like as a kind of this as an amateur researcher, I'm sort of influencing the subject without wanting to do it. And that's my observation.
And there's so much there, Robert. And I'm really glad you raised this. That also I've been thinking of you and hope you've been safe in the tornadoes. And yeah, half of my family is down in Georgia, so I've been watching pretty close. And yeah, so a few things there. One is when you're transcribing interviews, that can be quite time consuming and more time consuming than we recognize. It's important to think about what the purpose of your study is, in the sense, if you are doing more of a language or linguistic study, that it might be really important to transcribe every single syllabus and syllabi and word that they speak, right? Every single, and yourself, right? Because if you're engaging in a conversation, you're transcribing yourself as well. It might be important every single and the, right? So if you're not doing a linguistic study, you don't want to just skip over big things, because you don't want to just skip over things if it doesn't relate directly to your study, because again, especially if it's early on, there might be things that folks are talking about that start to become what emerges from a lot of folks, even if it's not directly speaking to your question, because this is where also after we do the research you look at, and you're always revisiting your research question as well. And that changes. And that's why actually the next thing we're going to do after doing this short analysis of your narration is looking at revisiting your research question. And so in that transcription, you want to, it can be, if you've recorded it, a good practice can be just listening to it once. not typing, not doing anything, just listen. And then you go back through, and depending, some people will listen to it twice. I tend to, I'll listen to it fully once, kind of just take notes to myself, um, and then go back through, and you can see the parts that are just kind of chatter, you know, especially, you know, depending on communities you engage with. You know, a lot of the communities I work with, you know, it's always a joke with my partner of, oh, I'll be back in an hour, and he knows he'll see me in 5 hours. You know, and so it's not to say you have to transcribe every word, but I would encourage not going beyond just the parts that are getting at your research question, because there might be things that are brought up that you'll start to see brought up again and again and become relevant. So it's not to say you have to capture every the, but, and, but I do encourage to get in more than just what's being specific to your research question. In terms of where information goes, this is critically important, and this is part of with the informed consent form. In this instance, you know, this is, you're doing this for a class. And so, you know, this is a little bit different in the sense, you know, I'm doing this for a class. So it's for the, you know, purpose of a degree, right? Like, I mean, and hopefully that many of you are using, you know, what you're doing at FGU also in your job, and what you're doing in your communities. But at the end of the day, like, this interview in particular is for a class. And so if you're going to use it for something else, say if you're connecting this to a project you're doing for work, then that has to be made very clear as to where that information is going at the end of the day. Because that will determine a lot of times if someone wants to participate. If I come in and I say, you know, I'm doing this for a class, but oh, actually, and I work for the government, and this information is going to be shared in an official report, that might change if someone wants to participate. Or they might participate, but not share what they might have shared. And so
I
it's,
feel like I beg your pardon. I feel like maybe that's, I don't know if I'm reading because maybe that's what happened with the other the original subject, that maybe, oh, I'm all about dialogue and conversation, but now that you've introduced these strange elements like the recording and the waiver, which I really think is what I did is I said I wanted you to read it, but I also I'm going to explain to you that it, like you said, it's an exercise for me also to teach me how to research, and but it may become something, an actual project for me, or something. But I feel like that might have, I don't know. So it's, I don't know if that got in the way. But you know what? As long as the person is comfortable and don't want anybody to, I don't know, regret it or something.
what also, and what you just shared there too, is also why, you know, doing this in the context of kind of a class timeline is a little bit, is rather false to what we're trying to convey through this course as well, so that there's a tension there, in that if you're really focused on participatory research, that the relationship building and the trust building is absolutely critical. And that's why, you know, for this interview, you know, I'd suggested, if, and I know, you know, in your case, because you just moved, that was trickier. But, you know, for this interview, you know, if you had someone who was, you know, a close friend or a family member, you know, like you already had that relationship with, because you weren't necessarily gonna have time to build a new relationship. And often if you're doing this kind of research, that the first encounter, you're not gonna, there's not gonna be a official documentation, right? And so, you know, that you'll get to know someone and build that rapport and trust and relationship before you were ever going to record anything. One of the biggest mistakes I see, especially kind of new researchers make, is sitting down with someone for the first time and pulling out paper and pencil. You just got that person to stop engaging with you. Because we all think about that. If we just met someone for the first time, we sit down and they just pulled out a paper and pencil for our conversation, right? That's not what it's about. And so often, in a more ideal situations when I've had the time, I'm not recording anything for weeks. You don't always have that time, right? You don't always have that timeline. But that's why as much as you can, those relationships become key. And if you can't engage directly, then okay, who are the partners you're working with? Who are trusted, right? That your point of entry, your point of introduction is through a trusted relationship. So ideally, you're building that trust, you're developing those relationships, but you have to start somewhere. So that point of entry and that introduction becomes really critical. And it can also be really powerful. That's why we were doing just kind of this one interview and then going to revisit our research questions. Oh, good luck, Lynette. We hope you make it to the airport. Please travel safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
And so often what we do, so say for example, we're just launching some research where we were interviewing emergency managers and other kind of disaster folks impacted by disasters, as well as other kind of disaster professionals, if you will, about their experiences and responses to COVID-19 in the context of still going through other disaster recoveries. So say if you're still recovering from tornadoes or from hurricane or fire and now COVID hits. And so in doing that, we came up with our interview guide, but our team, everyone did at least 2 pilot interviews. And then we came back together and we radically changed that interview guide, right? So wherever you start isn't going to be where you end. So it can also be a really good thing, like doing an interview like this. You're not going to go and now just, okay, I'm going to go do the next 50 interviews for my study. Often you'll start with 1 or 2 and then use that to really reflect on, okay, what are the questions you're asking? What is even my research question? Do I need to come back to that? So this is why it's also, thinking about the timelines for research. That is one of the biggest challenges, is often it's way too truncated to actually do very robust, engaged research. And if you can have that time to say, do a couple of pilot interviews, meaning, that you're doing, you have these ideas of questions that seem to make sense to ask for your research question. They seem to flow well. They seem to be what you want to get at. But then you actually do that interview and all of a sudden it becomes very apparent, like, whoa, I totally missed this. Or, oof, this is way too long. Or this is super repetitive. Or I'm asking 3 questions in this one and that's really confusing. And so you have to go back and revisit what you've done. It's not, okay, here I've developed this and now I'm going to go run out and do 50 interviews. So it's always going back to revise. And especially that's why now we're doing this. You're going to do that. I'm asking you to do a short write-up, and then you're going to be revisiting your research question before doing your proposal. And so that it's not, and sometimes it might be, okay, there's a couple interviews you did that you don't end up using because, okay, you did that interview and actually it turned out we really have to change things. That's not a loss. And especially if you're doing this, say, for work, or if you get, if you're doing this for, for research where you get, funding support, that's where it becomes important too, whenever possible, to compensate people for their time as however is appropriate. Sometimes that's financial compensation. Other times, I worked in situations where that would have been insulting in some ways. And so it was more of bringing a meal or bring other resources, right? That the financial exchange would not have been appropriate. And so it's having an understanding of that as well, but that folks feel that their time is honored. And so saying all of that, what I'd like to do So I'm going to put everyone into, oh yeah, Maher.
Yes, I have like one question. If I'm doing like the interviews in Arabic and I'm using later like for the project like English for sure, do I need like to use like to make the coding in for the main interview in Arabic, or I need to translate it into English and then I make the coding? So what will be the best way to do it?
That is a great question. So you're saying for the recording or the coding, you said?
I mean, like for the recording, for sure it will be in Arabic,
Yep.
but I will transcript it. So I need to transcript it into Arabic, and then because I'm doing like the coding, so the coding should be for the version in Arabic or in English.
Great question. And it's, again, it's what's going to work for you. I mean, at the end of the day, the write-up that you're doing will be in English. But if it makes more sense for you, like that you have this transcript in Arabic and then do the coding in Arabic and do all of that analysis in Arabic and then at the end translate it, then that totally works. Or if you want to do that translation earlier on so that your codes are actually in English, that works as well. So it's at whatever point making that switch is going to work on your end. The key to when you're doing the interviews in one language, and then if you're producing something for it in another language, is that if you have a quote, that you make it very clear that that is a translation. So if you have a quote from someone, it has to be very clear that that is your translation, because things can always shift in translations, right? Even, if all of us speak the same language, we might all translate something a little bit differently, right? Unintentionally could potentially change some sort of meaning in a word, right? And so it becomes really important if you're translating between languages, just to always make that very clear as to if you're the one doing that translating, then it's, based on my translation, right? So that it's clear that, because that is, again, it's kind of more of that subjective approach, right? Because if me and Gunjan are both going to translate the same, say there's an interview in French and we're both going to translate it into English, we might translate it very slightly different, but that could potentially change some meaning. And so as long as you're really clear about it, then that's okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. Clear enough. Thank you.
And so, okay, I think what we'll do, let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so we're going to take just about 10 minutes. I'm going to put you into groups of 2. So just share for about 5 minutes each in your group with your partner, as to here are, potentially some categories or themes that you're starting to see emerge in your transcript. And in talking through, like, if there are any, challenges that you kind of had in going through this process, and, ideas for how to go from kind of this, having this transcript now to go into coding it and analyzing. So just think, share, hey, here's my research question, and here are some of those themes I'm now starting to see emerge that I could start to code for. And so you're just going to take about 5 minutes each, and then we will come back into the room, okay? All right, so I'm going to set these up. And I will see you back here in 9 minutes. Okay. You should be able to join the room, okay? Hello. Thank you for coming back over. All right, sorry I didn't make it around to every group, but it sounded like there were the ones I did make it over. It was like some good conversations and questions being raised. And so, yeah, I just wanted you to have kind of a chance to talk with one of your peers too about kind of some ideas. you're having in terms of your working through kind of your coding and analysis and any challenges you might have. What I want to do, I want to come to kind of any questions raised during your conversations. But first, I'm just going to share real quick, just a reminder that what we're working on for your the semi-structured interview and the text analysis is that, and these instructions are up on Moodle for this week, and also all the assignment instructions reminders always at the top of the Moodle page in the assignment instructions folder. I'll also email them out just to, so very sure everyone has. That right now you're at the point in this where you'll now be writing the 2-page analysis of the themes that emerge from the interview and that are relevant for your research question. And so this is, you know, a relatively short write-up. It's 2 pages, double spaced, and it's due next Monday night university time. And what I'm really looking for in this is, you know, your analysis is insightful and demonstrates critical thinking. The content indicates synthesis of ideas and themes that relate to the research question. And your structure is well organized to facilitate the readability and accessibility of the content, and that you've clearly kind of reread what you've written and done a final clear write-up of it. And so just be sure to revisit the instructions. You know, you can also raise, if there's space in there, any challenges, you know, that you had in the process that's helpful to reflect on. And thinking about, you know, what Robert shared as to, you know, if a lot is coming up that's maybe not directly related to your research questions, maybe taking you in a different turn, acknowledging that and seeing, you know, what that analysis might look like. So if there's any questions. Oh, Robert.
I have just a little tiny technical ones. What, along with that, of course, we have the analysis. The analysis itself should be in a format of reflection, or is it analyzing what themes came in the interview?
Yeah, it's
and
not your
not conclusion, not a thesis, right?
Right. You're not concluding anything. It's a reflection of sort, but really it's, I want you to stick to what came directly from the interview.
Okay.
And so
I was making it so much harder, yeah.
So looking at the interview, coding for any themes or sub-themes, and you're doing an analysis of that.
And okay, now I understand. I was making it harder. Now, do we also upload our supporting documents, or I mean, the voice recording? I doubt that, but
No. So
the transcription,
yeah.
nothing of that. Okay.
No, that so things like that.
I emailed the extract. I thought, because I thought it would be kind of overwhelming to get the whole interview in there.
Yeah, so things like, you know, recording transcripts, those, you know, typically would only be held by the researcher, or if it's being provided to the, you know, the community you're engaging with, that that should never go, say, to someone like me, right? if I'm outside of it, or you know, or
and same with the waiver, not the waiver, the disclosure.
right. So that's for you to hold on to.
Hold on. Okay.
Exactly. So just because, so typically, like, say if, you know, if there was, you know, a funder or something, the research, that would never go to them. That, you know, that information is, so often too, is it's talking through, and again, like, it's a little different doing this in the context of a class, but, you know, a good practice too is to also make sure that it's clear to folks how the data is being secured. And so if there's the agreement of, okay, it's going to be, you know, put into, you know, I'm holding it on my computer with a security passcode, and I will destroy it after 5 years time, or, you know, whatever that looks like, or, you know, that all of the information, all of the interviews that all the transcripts, that's going directly back to the community, right? So that there's an agreed process as to here is everything, all of the information coming back to the community. Because what often happens is at best, people have access to the results at best. What's astonishing is how often those engaged in the research and the participants and the communities involved often don't even have access to the full results, let alone the data. And if they have access to data, it's very limited. And so that's part of the participatory research approach, as well as also thinking about of where that data lives and who has access to it. And so that's where it becomes really important. That's not just results that are shared, but the actual data collected, and that it's agreed upon how that's best to share, of how that, you know, works best for the community, who that goes to, if there's you know, a leader that holds that, or, you know, that can get a little bit complicated, as well as you don't necessarily, you know, depending on people's relationships, it might not be appropriate always to share information that one person has said in a community and give that to someone else. So everything is deeply context specific. So there's never, this is why it's a little bit challenging sometimes in these conversations. There's no blanket statement as to, okay, this is how you safeguard data. This is how you share data. This is how you secure data, because it's always context specific, based on, you know, who you're working with, that relationship, what is appropriate for them. And so that's why it's critically important to understand, you know, the cultural, the ethics, the protocol of those with whom you're engaging, because it's going to look different every time. This is a huge problem where folks do, say, community-based work, or they work with maybe different, especially I see it happen a lot where folks work with like different tribes in the US, and they think, oh, well, okay, I worked with this one tribe and this is how the protocol worked, and so that's how it works somewhere else. Like, that is absolutely farthest from the truth. It is different every time with every community you work with. And so we can never assume, okay, this is how I did it over here, this is how it's now going to work over here. And this can be a problem, especially like I've participated in like global studies that have happened in multiple countries, and the exact same process for this was unfolding in each country as if it translated into each cultural context. And that can be deeply problematic, because what makes sense in India isn't going to make sense in Haiti, isn't going to make sense in New Zealand. And so it has to be context specific. Sorry to overharp on that. It's like where I get, but I know you all know. So I know we're just about out of time. Are there any questions at all for your write-up for Monday?
Yes, maybe a small clarification. Me and Mahi were talking about it during the breakup session. We were just talking about the set of questions that I had for the semi-structured interview that I presented last week. And the interview, when I tried to interview more than 10 people now. And because my research question was focused on the local context, it's about the prayer flags and all. I need to choose the respondents from where those practices are actually practiced. So for all the questions, the responses seem to be quite monotonous, and it looks like all the responses are same. But in some cases, you also find that you're just asking them about their perspectives and how do they feel, how can they find some alternatives for this and all. But then at some point, you also realize that, okay, what is the fact now? If you're just saying, you're just telling them, finding their perspectives, but you're just saying people are cutting a lot of trees, but how many trees are cut down? You have to have the data. But this, the local people do not have the data. And for that, you have to find some data from the agencies where people have the data. So I actually went out of this, and I just tried to contact somebody from the Department of Forest, and maybe I just asked him if he can just provide me data on how many black posts are issued in a year in Thimphu alone. Thimphu is the district there, the main district where I'm living. So in Thimphu alone, I just went to the divisional forest officer, which is for this region, and just try to find out how many trees are cut down in a year, purely for the prayer flags. So he has actually promised to give me one. He was supposed to send it today, but he didn't. Otherwise, it would have been interesting to know the number of trees cut down for this. But that's what I did. So when I write down this short analysis of this interview, can I also quote those data that I may get from the Department of Forest?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, so you could add a sentence in there if you want, but the purpose of this assignment, so what you're getting at, Dorji, that is critical information for your research. What this assignment is asking you to do is to take one interview and very thoroughly and rigorously analyze it. And so where you're going is absolutely the information that you would need for your research. And if you were writing up, here is my findings of my research, but this assignment is what I want what I want you to be doing and really focusing on is directly what's come from the interview, so that it's all about, this is practicing the qualitative analysis of how do you code qualitative information? How do you analyze that and then write it up so that it's coming directly from the interview? So it can be frustrating because you're thinking, oh, well, I didn't get this information. This isn't being included. This is missing. It's not going to make sense. I'm not looking for, this is like answering your entire research question. This isn't all of the information needed. This is directly what's coming from the interview. And the reason I say that is because it can be challenging to not bring other information in. And we do that in our overall research. But what we want to do here is stay really true and focus on what the interviewee is saying, not what we're saying, oh, this is like missing information. Because, if you were doing this full write-up and you were writing up all of your findings, that absolutely that is essential information. Whereas this particular assignment, I want you to really focus on what directly emerged from the interview. You could acknowledge and say, hey, this information didn't come out here, if you want that conveyed, but that for the most part, this is really focusing on the analysis directly from the interview. I'm not expecting this to answer your full research question or to have all the information. It's coming from one interview and doing a really deep dive into that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the clarification.
But Dorji, the information you got is going to be absolutely critical for your project proposal that you'll be submitting in a couple weeks. So you're going in the exact right direction as to like where we're going with this. So don't lose that information, because that is exactly what you need to be doing. You're a step ahead of the game.
Thank you for the clarification.
And so, yeah, so saying that, I do want to remind folks too, so, again, of what we're building towards with this, that part of the reason doing kind of this transect walk, doing semi-structured interview analysis, these are all kind of practicing techniques in building up towards doing this project proposal that will be due May 24th. And so what I'd like you to be doing, focus on doing your interview text analysis, doing that right up for Monday, but be thinking about, and I'll send a note out after class to remind everyone I want you to go back and review the instructions as well for the final proposal I'm asking you to do here. That's coming up pretty quick in about 2.5 weeks. and be coming next week to class with any questions and going through that so we can be sure that we're all on the same page with it. And so for next week in class, we're going to be focusing on visual methodologies. We'll be doing, we have a couple readings on photo voice projects that I think are really powerful examples of that technique. And so I hope you'll engage in that, and please just be sure to reach out if any questions are coming up with your text analysis and your write-up. Okay. Oh, June, yeah.
The analysis is included to develop the code.
Wait, so I think it's on my end. I'm getting a lot of static. Can you say it one more time?
This becoming assessment, we need to develop the code.
Do you need to develop
do I need to develop the code from the interview?
So it's not to say this is the only way to analyze qualitative data, you know. This is a core technique to do it. You know, I mean, if you have other methods of analyzing an interview data, this is one way to really kind of rigorously dive into that qualitative information. And so, you know, it's not to say it's the only way, but what I want to be sure is that the system you're developing is as rigorous as I think sometimes what happens is that folks can look at, it's kind of like the difference between where people differentiate between like soft and hard sciences, and they look at like, oh, quantitative data is like hard data and qualitative data is soft somehow and subjective. And that's why I'm asking you to really stay true to the interview and what's actually being said, and then having those themes and sub-themes emerge directly from what's being said. So there is some interpretation there, right? Because also, you know, both of us could look at the same interview and come up with different themes. And so there is some interpretation there for what we're seeing, right? It's that not everyone would come up with those same themes, but it can be a really helpful way to be sure that you're really getting into an analysis of the qualitative information. I don't know if, does that help? Oh, June, are you still there?
June, did you see my, is that what you're asking? Because did you see my chat question? Are you asking if we need to actually put the show our work, show the coding?
Okay, I'm super sorry about that. I totally misinterpreted. No, you do not have to show that. You're doing basically a summary write-up. Then that's what you're submitting to me. So I don't need to see your transcript. I don't need to see where you've done the coding for it. That's all the work that you're doing to be able to produce this write-up. You can certainly, if you want to, like the next few days, if you want to share with me, like, hey, these are the codes I started developing, like, what do you think? Definitely reach out. In terms of like what you're producing and submitting, that you don't need to show, okay, here is like this transcript and here is how I coded it. That you don't need to hand in. Sorry about that. I totally misinterpreted. Thanks, Robert. June, does that make sense?
Not very clearly, but let me try.
So is
type
your
it up,
question,
maybe type it up in the chat, the question, because I thought that might have been your question. I'm sorry if that wasn't the question. I thought that was part of it.
June, is your question if you need to show me the coding you did, or is your question, do you have to code the data?
Actually, I'm not very clear the assignment to instruction. How how to analyze, how to show, how to analyze actually qualitative research is very it's not usual for me. And what I understand is from the interview, extracting what the core, the value of the information that we're practicing. So the coding is one of that, because interviews is not just one people, some people. Then we need to make some summary together. That meaning is we needed to make a coding to make to show up some, not narrative, but actually I'm not very clear how to analyze it.
So an example in that paragraph we started with from the Paul Farmer article, and we said, okay, looking at these few lines, what do we see here? So we see that there's themes around health coming up. There seems to be a connection between health and economic status. There seems to be being raised ideas around fear, ideas around uncertainty. And so we would look at these, okay, these might be themes that are coming out. And this is where you talk about, okay, here is a research question that I have. So in your case, looking at agriculture. So speaking to that question, here is what I see from one interview starting to emerge that responds to this question. So, and you can certainly quote from the interview as well. If you want to show, okay, here, one way to do it is you could pull out, okay, here is a really significant quote that speaks to some of the themes being highlighted. And so this is a way to look at an interview you've done. Now, how would you produce a short summary write-up of here is what, from this interview, here is what emerged that answers or addresses this research question? I don't know if that made it more confusing. So you can look at, go through the transcript of the interview. And what you can do is just to start. Don't worry about the analysis yet. Just start by doing the coding and starting to develop, okay, here's themes I'm seeing. And you can even highlight those sections, right? Here's a sentence that's talking about this theme, and now here's this theme and this theme, and within that, so maybe there might be a theme that's, for years they might talk about the soil. And then every time you see that come up, right, when they're talking about soil, that's all speaking to that one theme. Within that, they might talk about, here's reasons why the soil is poor, right? So those would be a sub-theme. So the soil is poor because of drought conditions, right? So it might be soil is a theme, and then maybe drought conditions is a sub-theme. And so you start to build this story in a sense that shows, okay, here's my research question about agriculture. And now what I'm starting to see is that here's something happening with soil being a critical part in this. And within that, drought conditions are a critical part of this. And so that's what's starting to now speak to your research question. And that's what you're analyzing. I don't know if, and I know, and I'm not saying soil has to be part of it.
And Yuna, I remember, so you and I are doing by great chance, and I feel very good about it, that we're doing kind of the same kind of the same social research, community research question based on
It is quite similar.
sustainable methods. You know, I don't know what those methods are going to be. And I think I got also very, when the interview, I was like, oh, am I looking for an insight on the methods that they use? Are they looking for methods that I know about because I'm coming from this university? So I know, and I'm telling them I don't know. But I think one of the questions that I remember you asked is, how do they even feel about, or do they even know, or do they even have any awareness about sustainable methods? And I think that is the one that is more open dialogue of all your great questions that you had in your draft questions. I remember that one's a question that some of the interviews may not even have thought about. Oh, is there something else besides what I'm doing? So I think that might be.
And actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, Robert. Thank you, because that speaks to June. If you feel like an interviewee didn't know the answers, like, oh gosh, I don't know what to go with, there was no answer, that's a finding.
Yeah.
It's not, and this is where folks can sometimes shy away from more of the qualitative research because of exactly the frustration you're expressing. When you get into it, all of a sudden you realize it's really hard.
That's what I was frustrated about you. And I was like, well, they don't know either. So I don't,
so the frustrations, the challenges, I mean, I feel you to like my utmost core. I would be lying if I said I've never thrown a pen at the wall in trying to work through this information, especially when you have transcripts from 100 interviews sitting in front of you and you have literally 300 pages of field notes and another couple hundred pages of information from focus groups and observations and mapping, right? It is immense. And you don't even know if there's quote answers, right? What you're not looking at is, it's not, here's what I know, an answer I have. No.
Okay.
It's not, if you feel like that someone hasn't provided an answer, that's a finding, right? If you're interested in sustainable agriculture and the community you're speaking with, everyone's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know any methods for that. This is totally new to me. Well, one, that tells you, okay, is this even aligning with that community? Does this even make sense in this context? Or if folks are expressing interest in, for example, sustainable agriculture, but this is the first time they're hearing about it, right? So, wow, that sounds interesting. I don't know anything about it, right? It's not you inserting information in as to, oh, okay, well, this is what it looks like, and this is how you do, that's showing, okay, this is something that maybe folks are interested in. They're showing, oh, okay, yeah, we would want to know about that. So that opens a space for, oh, is there a program to be developed for trainings around sustainable agriculture? Or is it, okay, what you're, maybe it's also people sometimes, like a lot of, like I work in the context a lot of disasters. And when we talk about disaster preparedness, a lot of what people do in their everyday lives is disaster preparedness. It's not labeled that way. So if I went into a community and I started saying, so tell me about what you do for disaster preparedness, I'm going to get a lot of blank stares, right? If I said, hey, Melchiad, what do you do to prepare for disasters? He might just stare at me like, I don't know what you mean, right? But if I actually got to learn about practices you have, right, and see like, wow, that's amazing. You now have the ability to feed your family for a week if you got totally cut off of access from the roads and being able to get anywhere. Melchiad might not have said, oh yes, to prepare for a disaster, I have a way to feed my family for a week, right? but that might just be a practice. So so sometimes it's also can be thinking about the way we ask questions as well. I know this is getting a little bit off from from your original question, but just as we go through this kind of research, sometimes it can also be of the language being used, of the way that something's being asked, if that even matches with the context we're working in. And so it might not be about, oh, okay, I'm not going to ask questions. I'm never going to use the word disaster, and I'm never going to use the word preparedness in my questions. But that's actually what I'm asking about.
It's very dynamic. I think the quality research is very dynamic and very subjective.
Right, and there's no, that's why I say too, in a lot of these approaches, it's what works for you and developing a system that works for you. So I could tell you how I code qualitative data and my way of doing. So I don't like any of those softwares. They frustrate me, and I don't need the bells and whistles. And for me, it works of using different colors. And when I see a theme emerge, that's one color. And then I note down if there's another theme that crosses over with it. And I note down kind of those subcategories, and then I tend to kind of bundle things together, right? This is someone else who might see me do it, think that is a hot mess. There is no way that would ever work for me. I don't know what you're talking about. That is so not the way to do it. That's not their way to do it. Right? So it can be, it's not, it can be challenging because it's not, okay, this is a statistical analysis and this is how you run the data through this formula and get your answer. It's not that. And it's not, and it can be frustrating in that there's not always a clear answer. Here is what, especially in your case, right? Here is what people are perceiving. Here is what they're reflecting on. Right. And that's what, it's not that you have to have this research question and, okay, this is my direct answer that someone said in response. What I'm asking you to do is to look at what did they say? Now, out of what they said, what themes and sub-themes within that do you start to see emerge? So it's staying true to what they're saying, not what we think they should be saying. You can insert yourself in that, oh, I have a thought as to, okay, this is what's missing, or, there are ways to insert yourself in this, but for this assignment, because I want you to kind of dive into really practicing this, I'm asking you to really stay true to this is what came from the interview. If it doesn't end up answering your research question anyway, that is okay. I just want to know what came from your interview and how you analyze that.
Right.
And it's gonna be frustrating. I'm gonna put that out there.
I think, Professor, without this discussion, I would have had a lot. I mean, before the class, I was pretty nervous because, just like Yoon, I encountered. That's what I was saying, Yoon, when I said when I started talking to people, I started to realize that I was inserting myself, my expectation of what methods am I going to discover that will be a great thing, or what are people going to want to talk about? Their livestock, so they could go at length about that. And they may not be self-aware, that's the key, enough about what their methods are. So for instance, in one sentence of my, like you're going to do, of mine, I'm going to say, in speaking with Miss Whitfield about raising this the challenges of raising this livestock, it became apparent to me that she did not know the genetic lineage of her livestock, or